Okay. Oh, okay.
Okay, so I'm Patricia.
I'm Jalen.
I'm Olivia.
And I'm Miriam.
Okay, so for this week's discussion post, it's asking us, in chapter 1, Tatum introduces us to multiple forms of racism: prejudice, cultural racism, internalized oppression, systematic racism, active racism, passive racism, active anti-racism. How does she define each of these, and what are some examples of these that we've observed in our readings about Asian Americans' histories and studies so far? So who wants to start?
So for prejudice, she defines it as a perceived judgment or opinion based on limited information. So this would kind of be like jokes or stereotypes. And the reason why people are make these type of judgments is because they never take the time to truly educate themselves on the information. And one example that Tatum used is like when the student found out Cleopatra is a black woman, and they said that can't be true. She was beautiful. So like they're kind of saying like white people are beautiful and like black people can't be beautiful.
I was gonna say,
Okay, wait.
say something. I forgot what I was gonna say. Okay. I was gonna say that like that student who disagreed, like you said, had like a different view of what beautiful was, because he did
Mhm.
for that person didn't know like um that Cleopatra was like no black. They were
Mhm.
uneducated.
Is it
Um,
cultural next? Okay,
yeah.
who's that? Who's
It's
doing cultural?
internalized oppression.
Should we restart?
Wait, who's doing cultural?
Did we talk about that?
Wait, wasn't that Patricia? Weren't you gonna do cultural?
Shit.
Patricia, you're on mute. You're on mute.
Oh my god. Okay, we gotta start
You're
over
muted.
again.
Let's
We gotta do it all
restart.
over again.
Okay, so another type of racism that Tatum introduced was cultural racism, which is the cultural images and messages that affirm the assumed superiority of whites and the assumed inferiority of colored people. So an example is like how the media is constantly showing stereotypical images, frequently like exposed ethnic group or ethnic jokes of friends, family members, and we're really like informed of the accomplishments of the oppressed groups. And like all these ultimately led to negative categorization of groups that form bases of prejudice.
Okay. And on to the next one is internalized oppression. And that's a member of a stereotyped group may internalize the stereotypical categories about his or her own group to some degree. And then an example of that was an experiment was done on 3 and 4 year olds, and they were asked to draw Native Americans, but they didn't know who they were. So when they were asked to draw a picture of an Indian, they were able to draw like feathers and stuff, and all like the colorful feathers and with weapons and everything. And so the little kids had um, an internalized image of what they were.
I put that too.
Yeah, and they actually said that like the cartoon Peter Pan was where they found that information, like how Indians looked from that show.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of sad. Okay, we're on to systematic racism, right? So systematic racism is a system involving cultural messages and institutional policies and practices, as well as the beliefs and actions of individuals. So these are like where the whites have the advantage, while like people of color, Asians, blacks, and stuff like that, have the disadvantages. It's basically like white privilege.
An example I put of that, or like we talked about a lot of court cases like in our other unit. So there was like the People versus Hall court case where Chinese individuals weren't allowed to testify against white. And then also a very big one was like the Vincent Chin incident where they like continued to fight for justice, but then in the end, Evans was free of charges because of his privileges.
Mhm.
Moving on, well, the next one is active racism, and that's intentional acts of racial bigotry and discrimination. And in the chapter, Tatum was like, when you're at the airport, they have like this conveyor belt, and it's like it automatically moves like a flat escalator. So if you're like you're already moving, but then if you're like walking, you're gonna be like twice as fast. So it's like you're moving even farther, moving even faster. And like an example that Tatum used was like white people like actually wearing like hats and like being in like the KKK, like they're like, actually wanting to like be to like I'm stuttering.
There you go.
As in they're intentionally being racist to like people of color. And then the other one is passive racism. And same thing as the conveyor belt. If you're just standing on it, you're still moving forward with it, but you're not putting your own effort into it. So it's like saying saying like racist jokes or like laughing at it, like you're like supporting the act of racist people.
And then for active anti-racism, she defines it as the process of identifying and eliminating racism by making changes. So it's like they're educating themselves so that they like know what like is unequal. And then an example that, or not an example, oh yeah, an example is the civil rights movement, and also how that the UC kids were like protesting for ethnic studies programs and classes. Yeah.
So,
I want to say something. It doesn't go with like the question, but I just found it really uh, funny in chapter one was when the teacher was like explaining stuff to the students. One of the students was like, "Oh, there's still racism," and like she was white, and like I just thought of it as really funny. Like
Mm.
how like I saw it as like a white girl, like, "Oh, there's still racism." Like dummy, like there's racism. Like there was never, like, it never stopped, and
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I feel like it's like I could be wrong, but I feel like it's the white people that are always saying like, "Oh, there's no racism," but people, it's always like the people of color that, like, yeah, there's still racism till this day.
I feel like the reason why, like, I guess, like, white people would say that is because they don't experience as much racism as, like, other ethnic groups do. That's why she's like, she doesn't really know, or she's all like, there's still racism.
Actually, they do receive racism, but it's the better part of racism. Like they're not, they're discriminated, but in a positive way. Like they see them
Mm-hmm.
as white, so they're like that's why I have white privilege.
Mhm.
It's not like black people or people of color that they say, oh, you can't have this job because of your background. But like for a white
Mm-hmm.
person, they'll be like, oh yeah, like without an interview, oh yeah, you got the job, because they expect that person to be like really good and clean and all.
Mm-hmm.
anybody else want to say about that? Or
Do you want to go to the next question?
Uh,
yeah,
does anyone else want to say anything about the first topic? Any last thoughts?
okay.
No?
We'll move on to the second
For sure.
question.
We can move on.
Okay. In chapter 2, Tatum talks about identity and categorizes identities into two classes, dominant and subordinate groups. Describe each of these, meaning discuss what Tatum says about dominant and subordinate groups, and discuss how you observe them in your world.
I can start. Or do
Yeah.
you want, go ahead, Hillary.
Oh, okay. So I was just gonna define them. Dominant groups are basically the systematically advantaged by the society because of group membership. So, like in this case, it would probably be white people. And then subordinate are the targeted group, which is they're systematically disadvantaged. So they would probably be like Asians, like African Americans.
I also wrote that. And adding on, dominant is like superior, so they have like the power and authority, while subordinate are like kind of like the inferior. So like what Olivia was saying, like people of color, Asians, Africans, all those other ethnic groups that aren't white.
And I want
And
to add on that. Oh, sorry. I want to say
no, go
something.
ahead. Go
Um,
ahead.
that the dominant, like they always want to have like the best jobs. They their history is like taught in classes and all that, and their like relationships are always like validated by society.
That was a really
And
good
then
point.
yeah. And I was also going to say that the dominant group sets the parameters within the subordinate group, and then they determine how that power and authority may be acceptably used. So they kind of just like determine everything that the subordinate group does.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was thinking for the dominant group, it kind of reminded me of like government, because how Olivia said like they determine power and all that, and how it's
And
like
I want to add on that like the subordinates, they just want to survive in the relationship. Like they they like see what the behavior of the like, dominant, and then when they see something that's like, okay, I shouldn't be doing this, then they like, try to move away from it so the dominant doesn't like get crazy and like, be like abusive.
Mm-hmm. And tying on to that, the question asks, do Asian Americans belong to the dominant or subordinate group? And I would put them in the subordinate group because just like Jalen was saying, how they're like focused on survival. So like they're trying to just like kind of like assimilate, but at the same time like kind of stay back because they don't want like to be hated.
yeah. I also agree with Miriam that Asians belong in the subordinate group.
Also for the dominant, I want to add that they don't like inequality. Like they're blinded by their like ego, I guess, that they don't see like differences. Like they see like everyone is the same.
Mhm.
So adding to what Jalen said about inequality, I actually want to point out a quote. What Tatum said. She wrote, Miller points out that dominant groups generally do not like to be reminded of the existence of inequality, which I think is like what Jalen said, that they don't like to be reminded that not everybody is equal or have like the same white privilege as they do. You know, like they just want to forget that that whole part of the world is like, it doesn't exist. Yeah.
And adding on to that, it's like when the subordinate groups do something better than the dominant group, they'll try to like deny or refuse that like, oh, like subordinate groups are better than them.
Yeah, they almost feel like threatened by them.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I want to add on that like if a subordinate group tries to like show their dominance, like they get credit for it, but in like it's not really credit. Like how like the person says it, it's like it's wrong because I think an example was the teacher who was like a black African American lady who was giving a presentation, and a white dude said, if I closed my eyes, I wouldn't have known it was a black lady. Like, she gave her credit, but it wasn't in the right way.
Yeah.
And she said that like this is how a black woman sounds.
Yeah.
You guys want to talk about the relationship between the dominant and the subordinate groups?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So for what I put for that, but the relationship of the dominants to the subordinates is often one in which the targeted group is labeled as defective or substandard in significant ways. So, like, an example for that are when people say women are less emotionally stable than men.
Oh, true. Yeah.
And, like, it was basically that the dominant group is assigning the role to the subordinate that reflect their devalued status, reserving a higher value for them.
Mm-hmm. There was another example that she gave that had blacks have been characterized as less intelligent than whites.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess another example would kind of be like what Professor Kim talked about in her pre-lecture video, which are beauty standards. So like the dominant would be like the tall, skinny, white individuals, while the subordinate groups would be like others that don't fit into that category.
And they were talking about how dominant is the normal to society. So all like the subordinate groups try to like change themselves to fit into that dominant role. Like there was an example that like, darker people try to become lighter to show that they're white and more like superior. And I found that as an example like in Mulan and like even in like Europe they would like cover your like face in white like for makeup. And I thought of it as
Oh
like
yeah.
white is like superior, and like if you were dark, that means like you would work in the fields. So that means you're like poor, so you don't have classes.
Adding on to what Jalen said, those are kind of like stereotypes, and then specifically for like Asian individuals in movies and stuff, they're seen as like nerds or tourists or like ninja people. And then in Mean Girls, there was like that group at the in the cafeteria, like group of Asians, and they were portrayed as like they can't speak English properly. Or like in Pitch Perfect, there was like the girl who was like really shy and she was like seen as mute. So and then in cartoons, like they'll have like heavy accents or they'll have like the slanted eyes. So those are kind of like the stereotypes that Asians are perceived as.
And don't like some people over exaggerate accents sometimes. So like when you're Asians, for example, like Filipino, I mean like I do it too with my mom. But like some people over exaggerate their accents, you know, trying to like mimic them. So you guys just want to talk about what else?
I have a question.
Go for it.
In the relationship between dominant and subordinate, who do you think needs the other one more? If that makes sense.
Do what?
Like in a relationship between a dominant and a subordinate um, relationship, who do you think needs the other more? Does the dominant like need the subordinate to feel a type of way, or does subordinate like to feel this like degrading by the dominant more?
I feel like it could go like half and half, like either way, because a way that subordinate can be kind of it pushes the dominant to do better because the dominant group wants to be way better than them. And then so it kind of just pushes them like, oh, like I need to be better than those people. So I need to like do more, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Adding on to that, it kind of also makes the dominant group more aware of like their privileges and advantages because the subordinates have to work like so much harder to get to where the dominant groups are.
I feel like I'm gonna put it in like a marriage situation. Say like the father or the husband is the dominant, and then the wife is like the subordinate, where she just follows everything the husband does. I feel that the husband would lose more because he relies so much on the wife to do everything that if the wife is gone, the husband's gonna be like, wait, how do you do this? And how like,
Right.
and like the wife can like live her life because she already knows what to do. It might like be hard for her since she's alone, but she has like the basic knowledge of what to do.
Right. And then like even like the dominant group wouldn't be dominant without the subordinate people. So
Yeah.
for example, like billionaires wouldn't be billionaires if it weren't for us, like for like working class people working for them and everything to make their billions. Yeah.
So you kind of need both groups to have like one dominant and one subordinate. Oh shoot!
Mm-hmm.
I blocked myself out.
No, you're good.
Okay. Do you guys will have any other like questions, or we're not?
Actually, I have a question again.
Go for it.
Um, how do you think a relationship would be if it was like say both dominant or both subordinate? Do you think the relationship would last or it just fall completely into chaos?
I feel like it would be chaotic
Chaotic.
because like if there's two dominant groups, they'll like be fighting
Too much
against each other to be more like powerful, and that won't really work out well.
Yeah, I guess it just depends on like the person though, because
Mhm.
they also say how like opposites attract and everything, and they are like complete
Mhm.
opposite. So just depends on yeah the person.
Wait, did we do number three?
What's number 4?
Oh, the optional?
Optional.
You guys want
I
to do
didn't answer it. Yeah.
Okay. So since we're at the end, I just want to ask everybody: do you guys like the reading? Because I honestly, I mean, not to like sound rude or anything, I didn't really like it. Only because it got me like confusing. But I think the examples made it like clear of like the different types of racisms. It made it like a lot clearer to me. Yeah. Which
I
It was
also. Oh, go ahead.
okay. I was just gonna say it was like it was so. But it informed you a lot about the different types of racism. So that was a good
yeah.
part.
Yeah, I also agree with both you guys. I think it's just because like we don't really know like the definition of racism in depth.
Mm-hmm.
But then like all the examples that she gave us were really helpful.
True. Yeah. Anything you want to say, Jalen?
I think we're all good.
Yeah, we had so many pauses, but that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think that should be the end of our discussion post this week. Thank you guys so much.